Hey, everybody. Welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Amy.
And this is Margaret. And today we are talking about, am I helping or am I helicoptering?
Oh, boy. I have feelings about this. I have feelings about the term helicopter parent. I think it's usually pretty gendered. I think
Correct.
it's over-applied. And yet, I will say it's one of those things where you know it when you see it.
I think that's probably right. And I think it's definitely it's your fault, mom, for doing too much, mom.
Right.
Also, why did you leave your child unattended? I'm calling the police.
Right.
It's definitely like pick a lane. Whatever you do is wrong. Let's just assume that, first of all.
Right. Never take your eyes off your kid and then stop it, mom. Never taking your eyes off your kid. Right. So I'm doing what you told me to do.
Yeah. And I think that this is something that has become extremely anecdotally true. Like kids today, they go to college and they call their mom to find out what to order for dinner. Kids today bring parents with them on job interviews.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not sure how much of the anecdote is true, basically.
Yeah.
That being said, I think that there is a tremendous truth to the fact that we are all accidentally high information parents, whether we want to be or not.
Yeah.
You don't have to go read 25 different parenting books. Every headline you see is, this mom has the secret to kids who sit quietly during dinner. And it's like someone has figured out something you haven't. And I think that the general anxiety that is caused by you have access to everything that is going on in the entire world all the time is very anxiety producing. And so that our ability to assess risk is fundamentally problematic, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this has been proven a million times in a million different ways that, it's people are scared of flying versus taking their car. And your statistical risk of being killed in a car is exponentially higher than dying in an airplane crash. But the idea of an airplane crashing is so frightening that you over-invest in the idea of that fear. Similarly,
yes.
Your ability to assess risk for your children, the most common example being stranger danger, stranger kidnapping, right? That that everywhere you go, there's a million traffickers just waiting in every park and around every corner to grab children and make off with them, is a reality that we are extremely fearful of and is statistically insignificant. The people who tend to harm children are people who are close to our own home. It is very rarely a stranger.
Can I give a recent example? It isn't even parenting related, but this is just a funny story. So
you may.
The last time Margaret came to visit me in New York City, I forget what, we were just going out to dinner or something. And you said something about I'm a little worried I'm going to get punched in the face. And I said, what are you talking about? You're like, women are getting punched in the face in New York City. I'm like, what? And you were like, no, it's happening everywhere. I'm like, I live here and I don't know what you're talking about, but you're on TikTok and I'm not on TikTok, at least not very much. And so from your TikTok point of view, every time you open your phone, TikTok is showing you like, oh my gosh, you can hardly get to the corner in New York City.
It's a punch
That's
fest.
Somebody stepping out and punching a woman in the face. And I was like,
every 2 minutes, that's 50 women are punched in the face in New York.
Right.
Right.
And
Bethany
the more you watch
Frankel
it,
had gotten punched in the face.
Oh my gosh. Well,
which maybe
who
was
knows?
A
That could be a lot of people.
Frankel thing. But yeah. No, and it to me, I laugh at the people who, relatives of mine from the South who are always like, I hope you don't ever go into New York City.
Right.
You don't go, right? Like,
right.
Please, if you have to go, take a taxi to your exact destination, because they literally picture it like there's an old movie called LA Story. Now, this is before everyone's time. It's not even an oldie Lux alert. It's a gone from popular culture alert. But there used
Sarah
to be
Jessica Parker as like a little like barely teeny bopper. Like she's young.
She plays
daffy,
Steve Martin's like
really
very
young girlfriend. Yeah.
But there used to be freeway shootings were there's always a thing, right? It's like shark attacks in the summer and LA freeway shootings, people shooting at each other from their cars. And there's a scene in this movie, LA Story, where Steve Martin and maybe Sarah Jessica Parker, whoever he's with in the car, they're just driving down the freeway and they're just have a gun out the window and they're just shooting at each other, like bullets flying everywhere on the highway. And I think that's how people picture New York. All of this to say that our input of anxiety-producing material is huge.
Higher, bigger every day.
Gives us an instinct to protect our children. And then it's like, your dumb kid is going to have to bring his mom to his job application, you loser. And that's not super fair. So,
well, I do think, having done this podcast for such a long time, right? I mean, I can separate out the mom blaming thing from the impulse, taking it away from the threats of being punched in the face everywhere we go, and down to the a 2-year-old who is struggling to get a third block to go a top 2 blocks, like something like that in the micro. I do sometimes see parents out in the wild, like interfering, like rushing to fix something, rushing to put the straw in the juice box, whatever it is, in those little helping ways. And I do see that sometimes and think you need to let the kid struggle for a minute. You need to let the kid try to buckle their own car seat, even though it's such a pain in the tush, or try to put their own shoes on, even though you're already 3 minutes late to go somewhere. That it's that very micro helping. I do think that's something that you can look at for yourself and make sure sometimes you're letting your kid get at something by themselves, even if it'll take them longer.
And I'm going to argue that there's a lot of macro stuff too.
Yeah.
I think it's both.
Yeah, it is both.
Amy, let me lay a little National Institute of Health on you.
Okay.
So they have studied, because this is obviously like anecdotally based. This is what they say. Emerging evidence suggests that overprotective and controlling parenting, often referred to as, quote, helicopter parenting, unquote, may have negative implications on the child's mental health, such as anxiety and depression. The majority of studies found a direct relationship between helicopter parenting and symptoms of anxiety and depression. However, there have been no longitudinal studies of sufficient quality to determine if helicopter parenting precedes the outcome of anxiety and depression. So long-term studies have not been done. So
there's helicopter parenting, right? Helicopter parenting, and then there's anxiety and depression in the kid. But they haven't proven that first comes the helicopter parenting and then comes the anxiety and depression. That's how I interpret that.
That being said, I think for the purpose of the conversation, there are lots of studies, and I think that there's been a lot of writing on the fact that that this generation is suffering from a lot of, this generation meaning I would say kids today and up to 25, let's say, are struggling with anxiety and depression. And that in the oldie times, maybe people didn't acknowledge their anxiety and depression in the same way. There's lots of factors.
Yeah, I think so.
But the anxiety and depression that is manifesting in kids today, according to therapists and psychiatrists, does seem to have an element of, it used to be, I feel like our generation, when people went to therapists, it was like, they had a presenting trauma, right? Like my parent was an alcoholic. I had the X or Y, like very specific problem kind of. And now it's a more diffuse kind of anxiety and depression that is a little bit like, I don't know kind of how to function in a scary world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then there's the pandemic, right? Which caused, we all spent more time at home together. I think if there's any measurable failure to launch among high school and college aged kids right now, it's not because their mothers are annoying. It's because we all spent a lot more time together and they were away from peers during those formative years. And it is an anxiety producing time. And the anxiety of what was going on out in the world, coupled with the being taken away from your peers and being secluded, I think that causes anxiety and depression. But it's not because mom is annoying. We've lived through an anxiety producing time that brought us closer together with our nuclear families by design.
Agree, but also want to push back a little bit because I don't think the thesis has to be mom is annoying, but I do think there's a problem to get at here, which is an instinct to overparent that comes from a very valid place that we should be working against nonetheless. It's not about blaming mom, but it is about saying there are places where you and I have both done this, and there are places that our peer parents have done this, and that there is a way to fight against the instinct to be the helicopter parent, to kind of move stuff out of our kids' way that can be fixed without it becoming stop being so annoying, mom.
Right. Maybe it's the helicopter parenting thing.
Sorry?
Like maybe it's the helicopter parenting thing itself. I mean, just listening to this from 30,000 feet, it's like, okay, yeah, anxious parents are more likely to have anxious kids because they parent their kids in ways that manifest their anxiety. And we can put this, cute little label on it. But when we're stressed, we overthink things that maybe we wouldn't overthink when we're not stressed.
Yes. And I think that is valid and understandable, and also something to be worked against as much as possible.
Yeah.
So let's talk about potential symptoms of helicopter parenting.
Okay.
And we're going to make, as we like to do, based on our friend Casey Davis of Struggle Care Podcast, morally neutral. We are going to approach the term helicopter parenting as a morally neutral term, that it is something that it is an instinct that many of us have to keep our children safe because of wonderful or protective instincts in ourselves. But we're going to try to define it and see where we can work around those instincts for our kids' greater good.
Being overprotective.
Okay. Correct.
All right.
So the first symptom of helicopter parenting is being overprotective, right? We get it. Another symptom, which I think sort of gets forgotten in the helicopter parenting, is putting excessive pressure on children. And this isn't only a mom thing. I mean, this is sort of the cliche of the dad who is screaming at their kid and making them cry on the baseball diamond because they're not hitting the ball correctly, right?
Yeah, this is the battle hymn of the tiger mom.
Yes.
That she would... Amy Chua, that she's like, I would tie my kids to the piano bench until they got their song perfect. And don't you wish you were like me? And it was presented glowingly, pretty much, in the press.
Correct. Although she would not, just in the interest of legality, tie her children to a piano bench. Amy is using that as a metaphor. Micromanaging. I think this is the thing that we often think of, which is like mom does everything for the child. And this one, I think, is the root of a lot of things. And this is where we can talk about this as a problem that is also comes from a place of care for the parent and not judgment of the parent. Intense desire to provide a different childhood for your children than your own. And I think this is a huge crux of what's really going on in helicopter parenting. And I think that many people of our generation felt neglected as kids. They felt their parents never expressed love for them or didn't express it in a way that was meaningful to them. I mean, I remember playing with my kids at some point in front of a much, much older relative. And I don't know, my son and I were kind of messing around and kind of wrestling and cracking up. And he said, I never ever did anything like that with my mom. My mom and I never laughed together. I think his mom was a Depression era mom who was trying to keep kids alive and, cleaning clothing on a washboard tub and didn't have time to play and wrestle and have joyful moments. But that maybe that sometimes tips a little bit into every moment must be magical. And I want to provide this kind of glowing, magical childhood that becomes problematic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have more to say.
Yeah, I have a thought on these symptoms of helicopter parenting. I want to bring it up after this. So these symptoms of helicopter parenting, this came from Parents Magazine, about you're overprotective, you're micromanaging. These are very subjective and they're very hard to measure. And again, it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. Well, I know it when I see it. That mom over there is being overprotective. But what does that mean? And I'm trying to think of how I would define it as a behavior you can define. And I feel like a symptom that I would indicate is if you're doing something for your kid, or you have restrictions for your kid or worries about your kid that are very much out of the main of what the other kids have.
What was the topic we were talking about, Amy? And you said it's like the standard definition. I think we were talking about conflict with our spouse. And you said, well, the rule is like it has to fit the community standard of this issue. Basically.
Oh, it was E. Brodsky, the community standards of caring, right, for fair play. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that the community standard of safety, and that's right, like figuring out, and I do think this has shifted a little bit, that
it does. Yeah. But let me just give an example. So like, for helicopter parenting, like, how do you know if you're micromanaging? Well, if your kid is the only kid who can't have a play date after school.
Right.
Because you don't know what they might be eating at somebody else's house, right? If your kid is the only kid on the baseball team that, I don't know, that has to wear two helmets, whatever. Like or if your kid is the only kid at the pool who can't hang around and play outside of the pool, they have to come sit right next to you because what if they fall in the pool? If your kid is the only kid with that, I feel like that's maybe something you can look at for yourself, because how can you tell a micromanager, you're micromanaging, you should stop micromanaging? Like, what does that even mean if you're in it?
I think it is, I think the way I understand it best is to constantly come back to anxiety. What am I afraid of? Is this fear realistic? Is this fear true? In community standards, could a child at any time be walking to school and a van pulls up and someone grabs them in and takes them away? There is some chance of something very bad happening, of them getting struck by lightning as they're walking to school. There is always going to be some chance, but it's going back to the anxiety and saying, is this thought that I'm having true? And am I bringing my own baggage into it? If you were someone, and if you want to put headphones on your kids, I'm going to talk about something a little bit sensitive, or turn off before I continue. If you were a person who was a victim of abuse as a child, of any kind of abuse, your brain is probably telling you that every person who your child encounters is potentially an abuser. And that is, that's the truth of your own brain. And so the community standard, what does it matter to you? You had the experience that was true. Right. And so you're going to bring that experience. And so I think the helicoptering comes in as like, I can stay with my children every minute of every day so that nothing bad ever happens to them. That's the story that it becomes. And that you have to start winding that back and say, what I really have to do is prepare my child for different situations. Do they understand? Because this is what is so tough about this and kind of unfair about this. The more that you try to protect them, they underdevelop the skill of being able to protect themselves, which is eventually the skill they actually need.
Yeah.
And so
if you don't, right. If you don't let your kid go down the stairs by themselves because they might fall and hit their head, right, then they're going to get bad at navigating stairs by themselves. Right.
That what we have to understand is the relationship between taking chances and self-confidence and self-esteem, that we often talk about. Like, self-esteem is a mystery box and you have to find it and open it, and then your kid will have self-esteem. Self-esteem comes from, I walked all the way to the library and I picked out a book and I checked it out by myself, and then I walked all the way home with my book. I can do tough things. And then,
yeah, but so say, like, there is a difference though between my kid is going to be able to go to the library, walk 2 blocks by herself, and sure, somebody in a van could jump out, but that probably won't happen. I mean, statistically, that is absolutely true, right? That same person who tends towards anxiety in their parenting, if you are at the town pool, it's the danger. And I'm talking if your kid is, not able to swim very well, that danger is right there. It's maybe there's a lifeguard. Maybe there's plenty of people around. Like maybe your anxiety levels are excessive in a situation that there are controls put in place for if the kid falls in the pool. But the pool's right there. You see what I'm saying? Like, I think sometimes we stop, but don't worry about stupid stuff that's never going to happen. But sometimes the edge of the cliff is in front of you, and how do you sort of negotiate it appropriately and not look at it like the edge of a cliff when it's just a pool with sufficient supervision?
I have an answer, Amy.
Ooh,
from
okay.
our guest, Dr. Camilo Ortiz, who we will link to his episode. He talks a lot about the need for kids to find this kind of independence and the real challenges of it when we live in a very anxious world and we feel a ton of anxiety. And he says, start with emotional challenges over physical danger, right? So a situation that might feel uncomfortable for your kid is going up and talking to a new kid, or backing away from, letting them be at preschool without you, dropping them off and really dropping them with the teacher and leaving. There are going to be tears, but there's no physical danger, right? Like, you don't want to start by being like, oh, it's fine for the kids to be playing on the side of the busy highway. That's not what we're asking anybody to do. And we didn't ask ourselves to do it. But I think so much of this work is examining the truth of the dangers. But I like that idea of you start with things that are emotionally uncomfortable. I'm not talking about emotional abuse or like just go up to the bully and, let him punch you. No, but there are, I would say, talking for myself at ages and stages, middle school kids, you know what? Talk to your friends and see if you can work that out. Otherwise, stop playing with them for a week. Bring a book to school and read it during lunchtime. I'm not going to get on the phone and call the other 3 moms and figure it out. That is an emotionally uncomfortable situation that my child is wrestling with, but I am going to allow them to figure it out. Now, if it becomes something that's bullying and I think it's a bigger problem, like, I will get involved and call the teacher and whatever. But I think that is a helpful guide as to how you can start doing this.
And it starts like even earlier than that. It starts with like the 2-year-old piling up the blocks, or it starts with the 3-year-old trying to tie her own shoes. And she's not going to be able to. And then she's going to get frustrated and bang her fists a little bit. And I'm not saying every time, but sometimes you have to let them experience the frustration of not being able to do something. And then maybe eventually being able to do it, and maybe eventually they ask for help, but you don't step in immediately. That's the easiest way to start doing this, maybe.
I think that's right, and just we tend to put it in terms of like, let your children walk to school or let them get kidnapped. Like, we have to take it way back from that place. This starts with active toys versus passive toys, right? So like, rather than toys that bing and boop and do everything for your child and ate the cactus dances and repeats everything they say, get them blocks, like let them. Active versus passive is a great test for some of these things, right? Like, let them try it. Can they do it? And then for yourself, I think, saying, look at how well you did with that. Like, I'm proud of you for doing that. Listen, I had a kid who I really wasn't sure. The other kids were starting to walk from school to the library in elementary school. I had a kid who I was like, I'm not quite sure. And coordinating with their teacher, we literally were hiding in the bushes. Their teacher watched them walk like halfway unseen. And I sat in my car unseen and watched every step of it and made sure that they were able to navigate the crossing guard across the busy street. Watched. You can do this at every stage. It doesn't have to be sink or swim. You can scaffold in a lot of the protections that make you feel better about things. And you can also have things that for yourself, like, I know a lot of people do not feel comfortable with their children doing sleepovers at other people's houses for fear that something's going to go wrong at the sleepover and their kid maybe can't contact them. I think that's a fine choice. It's not a choice I made. I mean, I was pretty much fine with my kid going everywhere, but I think it's worth examining, like, where could they sleep at grandma's house? Maybe that would be okay if grandma is, normal. Or could they sleep at your sibling's house? Looking for ways to have opportunities. We were just talking on another episode about traveling with other members of the family or letting other people caretake your kids. It shows your kids that it's okay to be without mom and dad.
It's also like the stakes of something. I find myself as I'm trying to remove the scaffolding, my kids are old. My kids are teenagers, and one is not even a teenager anymore. And they get annoyed when you worry about things you used to worry about that you're not supposed to worry about anymore. I find myself asking myself about little things like, what's the worst thing that could happen? So just a couple weeks ago, I went to Mexico with 2 of my kids. I held on to the passports. I did, even though my kids are teenagers, because what's the worst thing that could happen? We don't get to go, right? That seems like a high one. But
just for the record, my husband still holds onto my passport. So
that seemed like I'm gonna hover there. However, when, it was a 4-hour flight and the flight attendant's coming around with snacks and drinks, and one of my kids is snoozing through their one chance for food, until like 4 p.m. And, they are like half awake and they're like, wave at them off. I don't want anything. I'm like, okay, what's the worst thing that could happen? They're going to be really hungry when they get off the plane. I let that go.
I love that question. And I think it's a question to be very honest with yourself about. Having done some therapy as a warrior and a person with OCD who struggles with this, my therapist asked me that question all the time. Like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And like, but I have to do it. I have to control everything. I have to make sure everything's okay. Or what,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the problem with this is that with children, the or what is always they could die. And like, it sucks. There is always that possibility. They're driving cars. They're walking to school by themselves. They're maybe not confident enough on their bike to stay to the side where they should be. But I think that the structure of the question is right. And I think something that you're hitting on, which as we talk about this through ages and stages, that we often think like, well, I'll keep them safe until they leave home. And the reality is this work has to start when they're 2. It has to be when they're 4. It has to be go to the playground. And like, you might get yelled at by another mom, or a weirdo might come up to you. And I think that we skip the part where we talk a lot about what to do when. So I try not to get into like, I have kids who now like go into New York City by themselves. And I'll say, if anyone makes you uncomfortable, make a big scene. I don't care if you embarrass yourself. Go find the conductor. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, stand up and walk away from them. There are, on any given train, 95% of the people want to protect a child. But anything that makes you uncomfortable, and I try to think about like, what are the real problem sources? And if you get lost, find someone, my number, ask another person and make a phone call. Don't go places with other people. You kind of walk them through the scenarios that could happen, and then they're ready to start dealing with it, as opposed to I can only function in this scenario if my mom is here to handle the big problems.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's a balance even then, right? You don't want your kid to be so hyper alert for the 36 bad things that could happen on the subway ride that now they're anxious about it.
Yes. And I think
you're letting
the way
them go,
you
but
have
you don't
that conversation is really important, that it be very kind of factual and like, hey, if you take the subway, here's the things that might go wrong. Like your phone doesn't work, you go to the woman in the booth. Someone is, making a scene on the train. They're probably not going to bother you, but if they do, I bet the other people on the train will look out for you. You're a little. A weird person comes up and starts talking to you. Just say, I don't feel, you kind of run through it in kind of a dry way, as opposed to maybe, oh my God. And then I think the tone of it probably makes a big difference there. I have another slightly controversial issue that I will discuss after this break, Amy. Okay, I'm coming in a little hot, and I don't mean this as a criticism. And by the way, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me.
Okay.
I do think, and I really saw this in my children's elementary school experience, that being a parent used to be a little bit of like, it's something you kind of have to do. You raise them, they work on the farm eventually. Now, being a parent has become a huge part of our identity. To the degree that social media is involved, it can be a little bit performative. And I do think that for some people who felt, I think rightfully so, and I'm not talking about myself, underappreciated as children and kind of underloved as children, that we have set our caps a little bit towards providing a constantly magical childhood for our kids.
Okay.
And that the ability to talk about our children on social media and such, the tone of parenting has become a little bit, and I get it and I do it. Like, look at my kid and the magic of them. And, you know, I will see like the Instagram post that's like, you know, a cute kid making like a strong pose. And it's like, this magical creature rises every day to write her name on the world. And it's like, I love it. I love the enthusiasm. But I do think that we're maybe overcompensating a little bit in the like, you are unique and magical, which you are to us. But there is a world out there waiting for you where you are going to probably have to get a secretarial job at some point. And those people are not going to be like, you rise every day to write your name on the world, you know? And I worry about, and I mean, listen, my kid's elementary school was amazing, but every day was it's Dr. Seuss Day. And this time it's magical this day. And this time it's you're the queen of the parade day. And I just think that there are times where we make childhood so magical that adulthood can't possibly compete, you know? And
right.
I think that I have said before, we had a terrible event that happened in my children's school, and it was devastating to everyone, and it was shocking, but they were young. And I do think I have to be careful how I say it, because obviously you don't want terrible things to happen to your children. But
right.
Man, it did kind of give them the experience of like wildly terrible things that we have no control over happen. And that is true. And I don't think you want your children to only start contemplating that truth when they're 20.
And do you think that changed also your like, I will bubble wrap my children from any negative emotion for the rest of their lives? Like that you also encountered the impossibility of that project?
Yes, I think that's very true. That you see, my husband was a motorcycle rider back in the day, and he was an extremely cautious. He was like a studied, cautious motorcycle rider. And he was always like, I am so cautious. I am so smart about how I ride a motorcycle that I am eliminating 95%, which is true. Like 60% or something of motorcycle involved accidents involve alcohol. Like he would never drink within 24 hours of getting on a motorcycle. So he was so fastidious about everything. And then we got hit around a blind curve, just smashed into by somebody who crossed over the double yellow line and hit us head on. And I think it gives you that feeling of like, oh, everything you're trying to control is out of your control, you know? And I think that the info system and COVID and, you know, I remember scrolling those charts every night and I can research enough. And the fundamental problem is that life is out of your control and that the only thing you can control is yourself. And so the gift I think we're trying to give our kids is the self-confidence to know that bad things will happen and you will figure them out. And that's why we don't want to overhelp them with everything. We want them to see that they can overcome trials, because what I think the snowplow helicopter metaphor is trying to get at is the instinct to push all problems away from your children it kind of backfires, because then they feel more anxious.
Sometimes I think it might be useful, just trying to think of like a takeaway, to check yourself with whether it's your parenting partner or a friend, really tell you the truth. Like, am I overthinking this? And be ready to hear the real answer. My kid recently got had a detail on a report card that I thought was really missing the mark and pretty unfair. And like, do I do something or am I helicoptering? Do I invest? You know, and I was in that, like, am I a bad person if I don't say something? Am I a worse person if I do something? And so I checked it. I checked it with some people and before I made my decision and got the sort of same answer. It doesn't matter what the answer was, but I got the same answer from everybody. And then I felt like, okay, I'm doing the right thing here. You can ask your friends, are you letting Jacob go to the water park with the class? Does that feel safe to you? And if 5 other people say, oh yeah, I think it's going to be fine. There's going to be 4 chaperones or I'm going. And then maybe that helps you make your decision.
And I think change the question from, no, it's too scary to how can we make this feel safe? Like that's a really easy switch that I think can this kid, this second grader, walk from the school to the library? What makes that feel safe? I'm going to follow him at a distance like a lunatic for 3 days and make sure that I can see that they cross correctly, blah, 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 blah. Can my child go to the park unattended? I feel uncomfortable because they're alone. I would feel comfortable if there were 4 kids there. So let's get a group together and let them play. Or we're just going to every day sit farther away from the kids. We can see them, but we're farther away. We're doing a water park outing this very week. We get a spot. Does everyone know how to find us? Someone has to be with the littlest kid the whole time. If anything happens, come right back here to us. And it's like you develop, when you feel that feeling of anxiety, I feel uncomfortable with my kid going to sleepovers. Maybe they could do it at grandma's house. Maybe if they had a phone with them or a watch with them. Now, some people will say phones, keep them away from the kids. Whatever it is. I am worried about my kid going to this party. I'm going to develop a safe word and a code so that if they feel unsafe, this is what they're going to call and say, hey, mom, I'm tired. Boom. I will be there to pick you up. No questions asked. And I think when we switch the conversation from I'm anxious, so this has to not happen, to how do we together face the problem of this and overcome it, that's 90% of the battle.
And that example you were just using with the older kids, there's a big difference between you can send me, 1, 2, you can text me 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'll do the whole thing where I call you and say you have to come home right now. You're in big trouble. And we all know that I'm picking you up. There's a big difference between you're putting the scaffolding in place where they can take agency to get themselves out of a situation they shouldn't be in. Then I'm going to call or text you every 15 minutes and you better pick up.
Absolutely. And I want to say before we close that there are positives to helicopter parenting. Like kids feel very loved. They feel very invested in by their parents. And that is foundational stuff that is very, very good for kids. They feel that someone's looking out for them. And that does build a sense of connection, which is extremely important. It's just watching all of those moments where it tips over into your kids are learning the lessons and sometimes you're not sure you're teaching it to them. I am being taught that I am not strong enough to do things by myself, that someone else has to do them for me. Mm-hmm. And that's just a lesson you have to check again and again and again and again in trying to keep them safe, not ending at a place where they feel like they're not quite ready to face the world, which is scary and terrible. We get it.
I think you solved it.
Solved it. And it's not blame, guys. It's not blame. I mean, we've all been there. Amy and I were had our many, many helicopter moments in our own parenting journeys. Sure. But I think in the long term, I've rarely regretted letting the kids, soar a little bit more, even when it was scary for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well said. What Fresh Hell's going on tour this fall?
Tour.
5 places, all on the East Coast for now, but you can reach out to us and all the various ways to reach us on Instagram and Facebook on our website and tell us where else you want us to come next. But find out the tickets, the dates, get your tickets, all the details, bit.ly/whatfreshhelltour.
We will see you on the road, friends. Until then, we'll talk to you next time.
So long.